Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am in the Tiltyard of Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace was constructed on the orders of Thomas Cardinal Wolsey, who was the Archbishop of York. Traditionally there were two archbishops in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. Of the two, Canterbury was senior. But anyway, the Archdiocese of York covered the northern half of England, and Canterbury covered the southern half of England and was all of Wales too. So obviously back then this was a Catholic country, and the Pope can appoint an Archbishop a cardinal or not, just have as an Archbishop. The Pope could appoint a bishop to be a cardinal, or the Pope can even appoint someone cardinalum in pectore, as in the chest, as in that's secret, and that person himself might not even know that he's a cardinal. So strictly speaking, you don't need to be ordained in order to be appointed a cardinal. Having said that, I'm unaware of any layman who's ever been appointed a cardinal, but I fondly imagine that perhaps I have been appointed a cardinal by the Supreme Pontiff, only he hasn't seen fit to tell me. But back to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's boy from Ipswich. Well, his father was a butcher and/or cattle dealer, possibly veteran of the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. So Wolsey did not grow up in an upper-class family, clearly, but he gained preferment through the church just through dint of hard effort, natural brilliance. He'd been bursar of Magdalen College, Oxford, helped to build Magdalen Tower, which still stands to this day, which for centuries was the tallest building in the city, but he managed to almost bankrupt the college because it was so expensive. But he worked his way up the ranks by willing to do these dull administrative tasks, a bit of a plodder, but a highly effectual administrator. Even his most implacable foes, and there were plenty of those, wouldn't doubt the efficacy of his administration. And when it came to administering justice, they say that he treated those who were not from grand families, he treated them equally, which really was not the done thing at the time. So you can imagine why he put a few noses out of joint amongst the upper orders. Anyway, he said he didn't stint on his own luxury and built this enormous palace here. He held a number of clerical benefices and took the whole salary. So the church was obviously as corrupt as hell. There's a lot of simony going on, and people were paying their tithes, but it wasn't used for good work a lot of the time. It was just so a cardinal could live as a prince of the church. Remember, a bishop's house is called a bishop's palace, and they often really were palatial. But anyway, he ran afoul of Henry VIII. Henry, of course, succeeded to the crown in 1509 at the age of 17, and he'd been married to Catherine of Aragon, who'd formerly wed his brother, Prince Arthur, well, the Prince of Wales. But after only a few months of marriage, Arthur caught cold at Ludlow Castle and died. So they'd been 15 when they got married, Catherine of Aragon and Arthur. So, but did they consummate the marriage? They certainly spent some time in bed. Did they do it? Well, they're 15, I suspect they did. And it's not that they weren't allowed to, they were encouraged to do so. The fate of the realm depended upon it. So it's hard to believe that they didn't do the business. But anyway, so later that... Henry VII was elated that he got this marriage alliance with Spain, and then it was gone because Arthur died so soon. So, but he wouldn't let Catherine of Aragon go, wouldn't return the dowry or anything like that, and she had to stay. And finally got a papal dispensation to allow her to marry the younger brother, Henry VIII being 6 years younger than Arthur. So that was that. So they married, but after 16 years of marriage, she produced one surviving daughter, Mary Tudor, and several babies who died in infancy. So neonatal death was not uncommon at the time, even amongst royalty. So then Henry VIII, he read the Bible and read, is it in Leviticus, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy dead brother's wife. It is an impiety. If you do so, thou shalt be childless." Although I think it says childless in the Hebrew, but in Latin it's rendered without sons, because of course girls don't count. But Henry thought that perhaps he was doing something severely iniquitous, if this was a venal sin, or was it even a mortal sin, and so being severely punished by these babies being born and then cruelly snatched away. So it must annul this marriage. It was a nullity from the very beginning, because she'd been previously married to his brother, but the reason that they got the dispensation, the Pope's permission to marry her, was on the basis of non-consummation, that the marriage to Arthur just didn't take place because they didn't do it. Anyway, the Pope wasn't wearing it, partly because Charles V, that's Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had invaded Rome and taken the Pope prisoner, despite Charles V being a Catholic. I'm a Catholic, but I'll go to war against the Catholic Church. Logical, no? Because the Pope controlled the Papal States, that's central Italy, had a serious army, and indeed the Pontifical Navy at the time. So the Pope of Rome was not going to offend the most powerful potentate on the planet. Remember, ruling most of South America at the time. So anyway, Henry VIII got frustrated and sent her away, sent Catherine of Aragon away to live in Kimbleton House near Cambridge. It's now a school, it's an enormous building, so she lived in great comfort, said she must be now regarded as the same status as though she were my sister. Ooh, choppers. What was the next thing that happened? Well, so Henry VIII was irate with Thomas Wolsey, who was also his Lord High Chancellor, as in effectively Prime Minister, the King's most important minister in charge of the judicial system as well. The man had his work cut out. So he had failed him because he was lobbying the Roman pontiff for an annulment of this marriage to Catherine of Aragon, saying it was void from the very beginning, since she had been previously married to the king's brother, and that was a sort of form of incest, if you will. And to declare Mary Tudor had been unnuptially solemnized, but that was obviously mortally offensive to the Spanish royal family and, well, to the Habsburgs, the relatives. So they weren't going to do that. And Henry VIII said, Mary Tudor, she was born out of such marriage. He did have another child, Henry Fitzroy, with one of his mistresses, I think Bessie Blount. And the Pope even said, well, I won't write your dispensation, won't annul that. I'll tell you what I'll do, is I'll grant a dispensation for Mary Tudor to marry her half-brother, Henry Fitzroy, as in your brother by your son by your mistress. So he was going to sanction incest. Wow. So the Catholic Church is obviously so firm on moral principles. Unless, of course, you're rich, in which case principles be damned. Anyway, so Henry VIII, he finally lost patience with this diplomacy with Cardinal Campeggio, sent by the Pope to launch an inquiry. He was just stalling, playing for time, because time could resolve it. Henry VIII could die, Catherine of Aragon could die, she could suddenly give birth to a bonny baby boy, especially if her husband was willing to do his duty by her, or any of these things could happen, or Charles V could die or something, just making the Pope easier. He was being forced to choose between Charles V and Henry VIII, and he was more afraid of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, what we now call the Netherlands and Belgium, and much of Germany, much of Central Europe, the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, and on and on. Anyway, so finally, in 1529, this was confiscated from Cardinal Wolsey. He was later arrested and brought down towards London to stand trial, but he died on the way. He might have well have been put to death had that not happened. And there was a new Lord Chancellor, Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, Saint Thomas More. But that's enough about that. But Henry VIII then sees this, spent a lot of time at Hampton Court Palace, and this would be the Tiltyard, as in where they go jousting, because the days of knights were not quite over. Remember, Henry had fought some of these battles, the Battle of the Spurs, the Battle of Tournai in France, these enormously expensive wars. 3 of them he fought with a tiny gain against France. It really wasn't worth it. He was such a hothead. His wiser ministers had tried to play for time, talk him out of it, but he wasn't to be talked around. So they would build a barrier between the 2 lanes. That was the tilt, as in one mounted knight on either side of the barrier and charged towards each other with their lances and trying to hit each other and knock the other chap off. They're blunt lances, but nevertheless you could sustain a serious injury. The weight that was behind that was tremendous. That horse going pell-mell, so at full pelt. I mean, how fast would they be going? Race horses are doing 50 miles an hour at some time. Now, I know horses were small and they're carrying heavy stuff, but even so, it's amazing more of them didn't get killed. Just after he got this place in 1529, he built it, and this is where the jousting was held. And Henry VIII was an enthusiastic jouster, but you didn't want to do too well against him. I think it might have been politique to let the sovereign win. Although in 1536 he had a mishap at Greenwich, this palace. The original palace no longer stands, but it was to the east of London. Back then it was considered well outside London, where the Royal Observatory is, where Greenwich University is, and so forth. And a horse fell on him. He badly injured his leg. He never fully recovered from that wound. It was often suppurating, leaking pus to the end of his life in 1547, which is why he became grossly obese later on. Anyway, that's but the first recorded joust actually here, oddly, is 1557. Very likely it was prior to that, when his daughter Mary Tudor, well, a year before she died, she watched a joust with her husband Philip II of Spain. So she'd married her, I think it was second cousin once removed, but he was 12 years younger than her. He'd had been widowed twice. I'm not sure if any children from those marriages. He certainly did with a few of his mistresses, like John of Austria, who was born to Maria Plumberger. There's this lady from Regensburg in Germany. I've seen where it was. That John of Austria, who was a very notable figure. Notably, he commanded the Spanish and Pontifical fleet at the Battle of Lepanto when they put Johnny Turk to flight, and they cleared the Mediterranean of the Ottomans and won it for Christendom for a while anyway. Okay, so this is more of the gardens. I could walk around here all day showing you these enormous gardens. They really are king size. But that's just a little introduction to Henry VIII and one of his favourite sports. And by the 17th century, the era of the lance had gone because there'd been a revolution in military technology. There were muskets. They were using pikemen a lot more. The Spanish had perfected all-armed cooperation. They had tercios, as in thirds, a platoon of pikemen, a platoon of musketeers, and a platoon of archers together. The archers to fire at the enemy when they were distant, the musketeers when they were closer, and the pikemen to protect the two, but particularly the musketeers when the enemy became too close, because the muskets had no bayonets till about 1700. They were invented at Bayonne in France, which is why they're called bayonet. But anyway, we should have just stuck with the archers, frankly, because the muskets were so expensive, so slow to fire, and if the powder got wet, you couldn't fire. The range was very poor. They were heavy. So you're much better off simply using an bow and arrow until the 19th century, when obviously firearms got better with a longer range and a more rapid rate of fire. But they said, oh, this is the modern thing. Well, it is, but it's not as good as bow and arrow. And it made a big noise and smoke, so they thought, oh, that's better, frighten the enemy. Well, that's enough about military technology here at Hampton Court Palace in London. Come to Hampton Court Station if you want to see it. Right, toodaloo, make sure you subscribe.